Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Friday, February 17th, Sayre for Senate New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, independent LaRouche candidate in 2024, and I would like to begin this meeting with a short video, which is somewhat self-explanatory. You'll recognize Jose Vega, and here we go.
Cy Hirsch just released the fact that the United States blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You weren't briefed on that. Why not? Are you going to put a congressional probe into that? Yes or no? Because this ain't no ordinary journalist. You know that.
So,
I want to hear what he has to say.
Nord Stream is a pipeline that transfers oil from Europe, particularly Germany. I'm sorry, from Russia to Germany. So we don't have the authority to investigate pipelines.
All right, come on. Now that's bullshit. You know that. Victoria Nuland herself says she's happy that it's a pile of metal underwater. Do you share her sentiment?
Here's what we know. The Europeans are conducting an investigation.
They investigated her.
And it is true.
Why did Joe Biden say that we are going to get rid of the Nord Stream pipeline? And when asked, but wait a minute, that's run by Gazprom in Germany, how are you going to do it? He said,
we'll be able to do it.
If you have definitive evidence,
yeah, we do. It's called Cy Hirsch.
then produce the evidence.
He already
You already
did.
produced the evidence.
It already has
Read the article.
Listen, this is Cy Hirsch. This is the My Lai massacre. Okay, this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He is not going to publish something he can't prove. So unless you're naive enough and you don't know that, I'm here to inform you. I'm at least asking for congressional inquiry into whether or not it's true, because his credibility alone should prompt that, don't you think?
The Europeans are conducting an investigation.
We know the United States did this now.
It seems like you know the answer to the question, so there's no need to move.
Well, what are you going to do? I'm your
Every time I attempt to answer
constituent.
your question,
I'm your constituent. I want you to actually do something about
I'm
it.
going to try to answer your question once more, and then I'm going to move on. The Europeans are conducting.
That's a
an
non-answer.
investigation.
What are you doing? Because if the United States did this, you are going to hold, you have to hold them accountable. Listen, we are on the verge of a nuclear war right now. I don't think you know that, and if the people here don't know that, they should. Look, you talk a big game about the Bronx. You talk a big game about a lot of things, but guess what? None of it's going to matter if we're all dead. Think about that for a second, right? You are leading us into a nuclear war. What's happening in Ukraine directly affects what's happening here. You don't think you're going to get us into a nuclear war? Is exactly how we get into a nuclear war. Now, as your constituent, I demand that you stop funding the Ukrainians. I understand that you're also an Israeli lobby plant. Look, how can you deny what's happening to the Palestinians, but you can defend what's going on in Ukraine? And now you're trying to erase their history. You are the biggest fraud. You think George Santos is a liar? You're the biggest fraud here.
what people today call the deep state, but it's really not a state. LaRouche himself described empire as not being affiliated. It is not a nation state. It's more like a slime mold, which exists among a conglomeration of intelligence agencies, which are at the bidding of a group of billionaires. And he threatened them from the beginning. I also just want to say that we're on the eve of something which may be a very significant inflection point for the United States, which both myself and Jose Vega will be participating in, which is a rally called Rage Against the War Machine, Rage Against the War rally in Washington, D.C. this Sunday at the Lincoln Memorial, convened by leaders of the Libertarian Party, Angela McArdle, and Nick Brana of the People's Party, two parties with very different ideologies, economic policies, and their view, as is mine and that of the Schiller Institute, that if we don't stop thermonuclear war, there will be no point in arguing over any of the things that we disagree on. We won't be here to argue. I am one of the speakers at that rally, along with many, many other notable individuals, including several former members of Congress, such as Tulsi Gabbard, Dennis Kucinich, Cynthia McKinney, and Ron Paul, who's a former U.S. Senator. The comedian Jimmy Dore will be playing an important role there, as he has been. And there are rallies, by the way, maybe 200 sister rallies all over the world over this week to let this slime mold of an empire know that the citizens of our respective nations of the world reject their policy. Next week, the Schiller Institute is holding two very important events, one on Tuesday on the Syrian sanctions, the urgent necessity of lifting them, which is yet another demonstration of the insanity and evil of the West, of this empire. And then on Thursday, investigate the Nord Stream revelations, which will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. European time. Helga Zepp-LaRouche is convening both of these, and clearly, somewhere along the line, you have to wonder whether Germany is going to break out of this extremely detrimental alliance where who needs enemies when your best friends are blowing up your pipelines and making you freeze in the dark. So without saying more, we can discuss this later. I'm just going to try and very quickly give a little bit of highlight of some of LaRouche's work. There's a document on the Schiller Institute website on LaRouche's fight for 40 years of economic development that went through 2014. It really was more, because you might say it went back till 1945 when World War II ended, and he resolved really to do what he could to move the world in the direction that FDR clearly intended, which was to end colonialism. So you could say from 1945 to 2015, what is that, 70 years? Yeah, well, here we go. So let's just take a look at some of this. These are just some quick, very quick. So here is the outside cover of a pamphlet published by the National Caucus of Labor Committees, LaRouche's organization, in 1976, on an international development bank. And I just took a little snip of some of what the idea was. Here we go. Oh. And the dog definitely doesn't like the empire. So, says here, in his capacity as a presidential candidate for the U.S. Labor Party in the 1976 presidential elections, LaRouche celebrated the historic decisions made by the non-aligned movement at Colombo, saying, quote, "We have succeeded in mobilizing 85 countries and 2 billion people around our program. That's what I've worked for all my life. Our small organization has accomplished what many termed impossible. We must use our victory at Colombo to organize the American working class behind our program." And I'm going to go on. 1979. And you can imagine there's much more and many more conferences. This is just a real kind of skeleton. The Fusion Energy Foundation, which was founded by Lyndon LaRouche, held a conference in Paris on the industrialization of Africa. This is the cover of an entire book of projects and economic policy for the development of Africa. And I'll just note here, he writes, the purpose is to demonstrate in concrete form a perspective for the development of the entirety of Africa as an alternative to Malthusian policies, to launch the industrialization of Africa in the context of the New World Order. Malthusian policies, what does that mean? That population, according to Thomas Malthus, Parson Malthus of the British East India Company, the population grows geometrically, but resources only arithmetically. And what LaRouche demonstrated is not only is that not true, but the key is something which cannot be measured in the physical sense or smelled or touched or weighed, but human creativity, human creative discovery, and mastering more and more perfectly the laws of the universe, allowing man to use the resources at his disposal more efficiently and to discover resources where people thought they didn't exist. So that actually through human creative discovery, resources increase geometrically, frankly, at a rate faster than population growth. Then already 1980, the industrialization of India. And you see here in 1982, Lyndon LaRouche meeting with the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, in New Delhi. He and his wife had known her earlier. She had been the leader of the non-aligned movement, and she was a very strong proponent of his policies to reorganize the global financial system. Now here is a picture of LaRouche and his wife Helga, Sepp LaRouche, a few years ago, 1982, a meeting in Mexico with President Lopez Portillo. And in August of 1982, so you can see LaRouche was pulling together leaders of major nations, of blocs of nations, to declare debt moratoria, to end the reign of terror of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and to establish a new system that allowed every nation to develop. So, and he also was working, we'll see a bit later, on behalf of Ronald Reagan to create a back channel to the Soviet Union on the Strategic Defense Initiative. This drew the attention of none other than Henry Kissinger, who writes here, Dear Bill, this is August 19th, 1982. I appreciated your letter forwarding the flyer which has been circulated by Lyndon LaRouche Jr. Because these people have been getting increasingly obnoxious, I have taken the liberty of asking my lawyer, Bill Rogers, to get in touch with you to ask your advice, especially with respect to security. It was good to see you at the Grove, Bohemian Grove, and I look forward to the chance to visit again when in Washington. Okay, so Henry Kissinger writing to the head of the FBI, I want to do something about these LaRouche people. They're getting obnoxious. They're getting in my way. We didn't know at the time that in 1975, Henry Kissinger had written one of the most glorious of all Malthusian documents, a 1975 NSSM 200, National Security Study Memorandum 200, calling explicitly for the depopulation of 14 countries, saying population growth in other countries was a national security threat, that people would end up using their own raw materials, it would offset the balance of power. Therefore, we had to use food as a weapon, impose mandatory secret sterilizations on, I mean, it was really like a Nazi manifesto this guy wrote. So you can see why he was very unhappy with what Lyndon LaRouche was doing. And this is part of a trajectory of movements to silence LaRouche. So August 2nd, 1982, again, and I think our guest will say a bit more about this, LaRouche writes a policy for Mexico and Iberoamerica Operation Juarez. Just around the same time Kissinger writes that memo. And then in August of 1982, President Lopez Portillo acts on LaRouche's proposal by adopting credit controls on Mexico's currency, nationalizing the Mexican banking system, and announcing a debt moratorium on Mexican debt. In October of that same year, October 1st, he addressed the UN General Assembly and says, quote, "The most constant concern and activity of Mexico in the international arena is the transition to a new economic order. It is imperative that the new international economic order establish a link between refinancing the development of countries that suffer capital flight and the capital that has fled. Let us not continue in this vicious circle. It could be the beginning of a new medieval dark age without the possibility of a renaissance. We cannot fail. There is cause to be alarmist. Not only the heritage of civilization is at stake, but also the very survival of our children, of future generations, and of the human species." Okay, the president of Mexico acting directly in dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche on the proposals that LaRouche has made was supposed to be joined by many other nations, but Henry Kissinger intervened to prevent that. 1983, just a year later, or less than a year probably, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi hosts the 7th Summit of the Non-Aligned Movement in New Delhi, India. She says, quote, "Humankind is balancing on the brink of the collapse of the world economic system and annihilation through nuclear war." Sounds a bit like today, unquote, and calls for convening, quote, "an international conference on money and finance for development." She specifies that such a conference, quote, "should suggest comprehensive reforms of the international monetary system to facilitate the mobilization of developmental finance for investment in vital areas of food, energy, and industrial development," unquote. She also called for, quote, "a major debt restructuring exercise," unquote. And she says there were 100 heads of state present at this meeting. Quote, "The eyes of the world are all upon us. Let us decide here to usher in a new international economic order, to call for an international conference on money and finance for development." March of 1983, the same year, only days after the summit in New Delhi, President Ronald Reagan shocks the world, including people in his own cabinet who tried to prevent him from going with Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, to announce the SDI, the laser defense against nuclear missiles, calling on the scientific community, quote, "to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete." Taking up LaRouche's program. LaRouche had been Reagan's back channel to the Soviet Union. This will come up a bit later. And then here in September of 1983, you have LaRouche has written a whole program for developing the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins. I would just show this headline, "Andropov, you have chosen to plunge the world into war." That was the Soviet leader who rejected LaRouche and Reagan's proposal on the Strategic Defense Initiative. And LaRouche warned them that if they tried to go it alone without the United States, that the Soviet Union would disintegrate within 5 years. And he was exactly right. And then poor Henry Kissinger caught in a major corruption scandal. I don't know which one that was. I didn't reread the article, but here we have. So Lynn's unbelievable 50-year development program for the Indian Pacific Oceans Basin. I'd also add, sometime in here, LaRouche wrote a whole program called the Republic of Saudi Arabia in 2023. That's how optimistic and far ahead thinking he was, that Saudi Arabia could become a republic. Then in October of 83, he travels to Thailand and addresses a conference in Bangkok, which was jointly sponsored by EIR, the Fusion Energy Foundation, and that got all cut off, the Thai Ministry of Communications. So you see here this map of where the Kra Canal is being, I guess, various proposals for a canal through Thailand, which would alleviate this very narrow Straits of Malacca, where you have lots of pirates and problems, and create a whole new region, a whole new way of connecting nations, what the Chinese Silk Road would call the Maritime Silk Road. So again, think about everything we just saw between 82 and 83. It's amazing. No wonder why Henry Kissinger was going bonkers and mobilizing everyone. 1984, Helga Zepp-LaRouche founds the International Schiller Institute. Its founding document is based on the American Declaration of Independence as a document for the world, to be applied to the world. The rights, the inalienable rights of man, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are universal, not only for Americans. Then in October of 1984, Halloween to be specific, October 1984, Indira Gandhi is assassinated. Lyndon LaRouche wrote the following. This morning at 9:18 a.m. New Delhi time, assassins of a London-based terrorist cult murdered one of the greatest world leaders of our generation, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. My wife and I, who loved her dearly, cannot find words adequate to express our personal grief. If India is destabilized as a result of this assassination, the effects could become quickly as dangerous as the murder of the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, the incident which triggered World War I. Mrs. Gandhi was informed that an attempted assassination of her was imminent. She referred to this in an interview with UPI 3 days before her assassination. Quote, "If I were to die serving my country, I would be very proud. I feel I have to fight evil. I have to fight what is wrong, but you cannot be bothered about what is happening to you. In consequence, you have to go on with your job," unquote. And Lynn goes on to say that he's going to go on with his job. 1986, here's the book, the whole program, The Integration of Ibero-America. And 1986, October 6th, 400 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals surround LaRouche's home. We found out later that the intent was to assassinate him. LaRouche manages to get an emergency telegram off to Ronald Reagan, who was on his way to Reykjavik, Iceland, to meet with Gorbachev, who was going to try and pressure him to give up on the Strategic Defense Initiative. But Reagan does call off the raid being orchestrated by William Weld and the Bush family. Here's a letter from 1995 that Ramsey Clark, who became LaRouche's attorney on appeal, wrote to Janet Reno about the LaRouche case. This is just an excerpt. He says, October 6, 1986, indictments were returned in Boston against key members of LaRouche's political party. Simultaneously, a massive 2-day search involving over 400 law enforcement officers was conducted at the Virginia offices of several businesses associated with the political movement, and 2 million documents were seized. The investigation continued, and Mr. LaRouche himself was finally indicted in a second superseding indictment in Boston, returned during July of 87, and on May 4th, a mistrial was declared. During the period William Weld was Assistant Attorney General, they did not bring LaRouche back on trial in Boston, but moved the case to Virginia, where they could have it in a rocket docket with a judge who was the owner of the largest private arms dealing agency in the world, and a jury filled with FBI agents, and convicted LaRouche. But we will go on. So all of this is going on. He's being indicted. He's running for president. Whoops. And he warns, that there's going to be a major crash in October of 1987. He puts out the release May 26th. Sure enough, at the end of October 87, there was a massive collapse of the U.S. stock market. 1988, this was my first conference meeting Lyndon LaRouche up in New Hampshire. And there is Fred Wills, the former foreign minister of Guyana, and there's Helga Zepp-LaRouche. He convenes a conference, a new just world economic order, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It actually wasn't in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, but that's okay. I mean, LaRouche's conference, the original one was. Here in October 12th, Columbus Day, 1988, LaRouche goes to Berlin, calls for the Berlin Wall to come down, and the time is ripe for the reunification of Germany. November 9th of 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down nearly exactly 1 year after he says that. No one else in the world saw this coming or this possibility. But where is LaRouche? By that time, he is in prison. This is him being taken off to prison January 27th, 1989. Get him out of the way when the system is coming down. While he's in prison, his wife, Helga, comes up with a plan. The Berlin Wall is down. This is a great moment of opportunity to connect the famous triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. I think that's Lyon up there. A very, very densely industrial area, which can become a driver for the Eastern Europe. And you see these kind of corridors of transportation and development to launch a whole new era of prosperity in Europe. But that is not what happens. They had, of course, LaRouche was in jail, and Maggie Thatcher and Bush Sr. have the first Gulf War, etc. By 1992, the triangle has been extended to the idea of the Eurasian land bridge. And in 1994, after a huge mobilization led by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, making a gigantic stink that there were political prisoners in the US and LaRouche had to be exonerated, we got LaRouche out of prison in January of 94. He was still on parole, but in April of 94, he travels to Moscow. And the first public event is a lecture sponsored by the Ministry of Economics of the Russian Federation. LaRouche says, quote, "The problems in Russia are a reflection not of conditions internal to Russia, but the reflection of a collapse in the world economy. What is going to happen without question is a general total breakdown collapse of the global financial system. If there is an agreement on principles of sound economy, then there can be an agreement among states to reestablish in a very short time a new world financial and monetary system to replace the old one while we put the old one into bankruptcy." Think about this. 1994 in Russia. This is what LaRouche is proposing. Think about how Russia is faring with these sanctions now. They're doing very well, much better than the US. Here is 1996, a map from the World Land Bridge Report. LaRouche's wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, was in Beijing at a conference in 96, meeting with leaders from 36 countries to discuss reviving the Silk Road. This map was put forward, and I can tell you many of these projects are now being built. And I'm skipping a great deal. 2005, LaRouche in Berlin, A New Westphalian Economic Order. This book is excellent, highly relevant today if you want to understand what's going on. And then in April of 2007, LaRouche is back in Moscow at a conference to study the Bering Strait tunnel mega projects of Russia's east, a transcontinental Eurasia-America transport link via the Bering Strait organized by the Russian Academy of Sciences, Council for the Study of Productive Forces, in conjunction with the Russian Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. Boy, you can imagine if LaRouche were still running for president in 2008, 2007, 2008, what kind of Russian agent they would accuse him of being. And he says this onrushing collapse of the world's presently hyperinflated, disintegrating world monetary financial system requires early, concerted emergency action by responsible leading nations. They must include the USA, Russia, China, and India as the rallying point for a new spreading partnership among perfectly sovereign nation-state economies. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There's more, but the thing that really jumped out to me was the pace of what LaRouche was doing in this 1982-83 period. It was amazing. I mean, he was covering the whole planet, Ibero-America, Africa, the Kra Canal, India, and then, you know, Kissinger comes down and they pull out all the stops to prevent LaRouche from succeeding. Nonetheless, he still gets Ronald Reagan to adopt the Strategic Defense Initiative. And by 86, you got 400 marshals raiding his home. He's thrown in prison. All of the LaRouche publications are shut down in an illegal bankruptcy. A dozen or so of our organizers are indicted, incarcerated. I mean, everything was thrown at us. And I think many Americans kind of slept through it. They, you know, were swayed by the slanders in the press, which was the design. And you see how much we suffered, actually, if you imagine the pace of developments from 82, 83, where we might be. But I'll stop because I'm going to introduce Gretchen Small, who is with the Ibero-America Desk of Executive Intelligence Review, who is a longtime collaborator of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. And she's going to fill in some of the blanks and just give us more of a sense of LaRouche's work and why he was such a threat. Gretchen, go ahead.
All right. I want to start by reminding you, those who know it, or letting you know how the prominent Russian economist, Dr. Sergei Glaziev, answers the question of why LaRouche is so feared by his enemies. And Jose, I think you've got 4 slides there, which I'll do in order.
No, I was writing to that. I didn't get any slides. You didn't attach them, at least.
All right, so I'll just go ahead and read and we'll go. It's all right. But listen carefully. All right. So this is what Glaziev wrote in a message for the celebration of the centenary of LaRouche's birth, September 8th of 2022 is when we had the centenary. So this, I'll tell you a little bit more about this prominent Russian economist after you hear what he had to say. Glaziev wrote, "If the leaders of the world's nations had listened to the voice of Lyndon LaRouche, then perhaps we might have managed to avoid the social upheavals we confront today. He proposed a different model of globalization based on the principles of physical economy in particular, the so-called Eurasian land bridge," which you saw some of that from Diane. Glaziev goes on, "This is a splendid and interesting project, which now, after many years, has begun to be implemented through the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which we support, linking it with the Eurasian Economic Union." Lyndon LaRouche looked decades ahead. He warned the United States of America and its partners about the inevitable collapse of their financial expansion policy. The global speculators and world oligarchs, which are parasites on the monetary admission of world currencies, greatly disliked LaRouche for this. He was persecuted and faced with imprisonment. And then this is really key. Listen to this. In practically all the major countries in the world that today are developing successfully, above all India and China, there are partisans of LaRouche. They have used his thoughts and ideas for creating their economic miracles. It is the principles of physical economy championed by LaRouche that today underlie the Chinese economic miracle and are there in the foundations of India's economic development policy. The supporters of LaRouche in those countries exert a fruitful, very positive, and constructive influence on economic policy shaping in these leading nations of the new world economic paradigm. Now think about that. That's really something else. That's quite a statement. Glassiev is today the minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics for the Eurasian Economic Commission. He is known all over the world for his active role in helping put together the new monetary and economic system outside the dollar system, replacing the dollar system, which anybody sensible knows we need, including in the United States, since the dollar is no longer an American dollar, but it is the dollar of the markets and the speculators. So he's involved in that. He was in Indonesia very recently, working out how the Association of Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN, would be able to hook up with the Eurasian Economic Union. 2 years ago, I heard, to my surprise, I have to say, that the Guatemalan, it was the Treasury Minister or the Economics Minister, told the St. Petersburg Forum that I was listening to online that when you say Sergei in Latin America, in Iberoamerica, you don't have to give the last name, Glassiev, because everybody knows who he is. And that was news to me. I found that very interesting. And as you just heard, the countries that study LaRouche's ideas are the countries which are developing successfully, and the West, which listen to the speculators, are collapsing. Glassiev is, as Diane showed, he knows LaRouche's ideas well. I mean, he talked to him many times. He went to conferences of the Schiller Institute in Europe. He was there when LaRouche went on his, I believe I counted 7 times to Moscow in the 90s and early 20s. Glassiev was responsible for inviting, yes, there you go. He invited LaRouche to address a hearing in the Duma on how Russia could survive the economic collapse. And there were about 150 parliamentarians, government officials, high-level officials, people from the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was very important in that country, and it was broadcast live in the rest of the Duma building and to the Kremlin. So this was where LaRouche laid out his answers to Russia's questions of how you can survive, and Glassiev was the man who introduced him. So I think that, and the way Glassiev introduced Lynn to that event was, he said, "Here, I'm presenting to you the well-known philosopher, historian, and economist, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche." So, Glassiev isn't the only one who's been so outspoken about the role of Lyndon LaRouche. But think about that from the standpoint of the American media, and by and large, not quite so much, but also in the European media. The only thing you hear, if you see anything about LaRouche in the establishment media, are slanders, and that he was a total failure and a crook and God knows what. So, and here, this fellow who's at the heart of creating the new paradigm is telling us what we know, which is LaRouche played a unique and critical role in creating the possibility, which is the hope for avoiding nuclear war, to ending the permanent war policy and throwing out the financial oligarchy so that we can have relations in this planet based on the common interests of mankind. And as Diane went through, it took a lot of work for him to get to this position. So, and there is a video somewhere, which I didn't have time to get the link for, but we showed it at the centenary of celebration, September 22nd, the Schiller Institute conference, where you can see an hour of clips of LaRouche relating to these people on all these trips, the kind of profound discussions of ideas and the rapt attention that his audiences in Poland, in the UAE, in Russia, in India and other places gave it. So now let me just say a few things very shortly about how LaRouche did what he did, because his concern was always the interest of humanity as a whole. Now, he wrote all those proposals. None of them, all of them were directed to the immediate existential crisis of the countries or regions they were written for. All of them were done, however, from the standpoint of how the resolution of their problems could only be accomplished by resolving the problems of the world as a whole in very concrete terms, with long-term solutions looking decades in advance. Now, the one thing I want to say a little bit more about is the International Development Bank, his 1975 proposal for this, which did keep Henry Kissinger busy for years, trying to crush its influence. LaRouche, there you go. LaRouche wrote this after he had visited Iraq, and he had gotten a lot of questions from Iraqis and other Arab and non-aligned countries who were there. This was a period of great ferment in the developing sector, of how they were going to defend their right to development. And people had discussed with LaRouche and raised their questions of how they could use their resources to secure for them the right for development, meaning industrial development. And they were clear on that at the time. So typical LaRouche, the International Development Bank, which he proposed a whole new economic system to replace the post-1971 system, which was crushing everybody. He outlined it first in Bonn, Germany, then in Milan, Italy, and that was in April. And then he produced the report you see there in front of you in June, which was written as a campaign statement for the United States, for his presidential campaign as the candidate of the U.S. Labor Party, which was a party he had created precisely as a vehicle for these ideas. And so he proposed there the immediate establishment of an international development bank as an agreement among the three principal world sectors: the industrialized capitalist sector, the so-called developing sector, and the socialist countries. At that time were known as the Comecon in part. And he said, our core policy is this: the worldwide material preconditions from agricultural, mining, and manufacturing are essentially sound. It is only the debt-ridden financial superstructure which prevents those potentialities from being realized in the form of rapidly expanded levels of output at progressively reduced net social cost of production per unit of output. And that's something he develops in much more length in the document. It is available. We reprinted the core of it in the May 20th, 2022 EIR, and I really recommend it. It's very interesting. You'll learn a lot. And what he went through is that he had consulted with people, and there were all kinds of ideas that he thought were viable for major specific development projects, which can readily, he's writing now, over a 5 to 10 year period of development, yield a massive increase in the output and social productivity of world agriculture. And on that basis, he writes, the infrastructural basis for massive industrial development. And so the bank proposes some of these. They're continental projects. He took it from the top, from the get-go. And then you have to read the next sentence, okay? We have similarly determined the feasibility of controlled thermonuclear reaction technology. What he's talking about there are fusion power reactors, 1975. He said, which are within the horizon of such development programs, such that no long-term energy crisis could exist except through massive incompetence by leading agencies. And he was right. And the leading agencies were Malthusian. They weren't just incompetent, and they blocked it. And one thing he said in this thing that just knocked the socks off me, he said there's basically no basis for just relations of prices. The way to set the prices for the raw materials of the developing sector to be massively exported to the industrialized countries so they can produce in turn the industrial goods and the capital goods that need to be sent back to industrialize the developing sector. And he said there's no way in the ultimately that you can even set a just price for these countries using up their resources quickly unless you have fusion reactor technology being massively used, because that's the future. So he was defining where you have to go from the standpoint of the future. And what he's proposing is massive increases in the levels of industrialized output from the Comecon sector, the socialist countries, from the industrialized countries, and use that to transform the living and cultural standards of people in the developing sector, where you have peasants who, might not even know how to read or write, never had electricity, never had a tractor, working all the time just to survive. And how are they going to have the bank? That one of the major purposes of development is not factories and machines, and that it is how you raise the level of the populations participating in that, so that they can become factors, carry out this kind of development. So that's what he went through. Now, one of the things he did that's important, and keep in mind today, when I just said that, you have today, to 2023, we have probably 2 billion people in the world without access to clean water. We have an estimated 770 million people who have no access to electricity, most of that in Africa, but because India is working on their huge deficit in that front, although they still have hundreds of millions without electricity, and some in other parts of the world, maybe in the South Bronx also. And then you have 1 billion people who are starving. People who are talking about doing this on the cheap. People think, okay, how can we solve these immediate problems at the same time that you develop science and technology? That's something I get all the time when you talk to people south of the border, for example, like in Central America. How, we've got such problems now. How can we afford to invest in this? Or here you have the people who argue that you can't afford to have, you can't have this kind of heavy energy use because it's going to pollute the planet, with giving no consideration to the fact of what we're transforming the idea of transforming the whole earth and the whole humanity as one in a very clean, economic, environmentally safe way, but using these high technology solutions. And so LaRouche gives the answer to how this thing, and he says, look at this is 1975, and he says that a lot of the questions, a lot of the people he talked to in Iraq, for example, and he was talking to people all over the world at the same time, but they had said, look, we need a package of discussions with the industrial sector for reform of the system based on food, energy, and what was the third one? Raw materials. And LaRouche says, okay, you have to add in a fourth element, call it development. And he said the only technical problem these nations would face is they would have to come up a way that they could have a way of presenting a conception of measurable performance of development. What is real development? Is it viable for the long term? Is it some cockamamie thing that lasts for a month and then falls apart, or even just 3 years and then falls apart? So that, because he's talking about negotiating a treaty arrangement between the three major sectors of the world at that time for how to have a new system. And so he answers, the real core of the IDB program is his theory of the bank, as he calls it, that section, where he answers that, beginning with a statement that it's a complete fraud, that there are no limits, that there are limits to growth. Now, given the time, I think he just lays out that there's the way in which you can increase per capita household and capital consumption while reducing the cost for society as a whole of all that consumption, which is rising, and that rising because you're talking about people living longer, you're talking about extending their lifespans, the quality of life they have, that the cost of the electricity that they need to be able to have the cultural training and education to be able to participate in producing the great ideas of mankind, because that's what development is. It isn't anything other than developing the cognitive powers and the soul powers, if you will, of the human population. And he goes through and explains there how that is not contradictory, but absolutely necessary. Now, I'll just leave it at that with that paradox. I think, given the time, let me just say one thing on the on Operation Juarez and how that worked quickly before we do the big one, which is, as Glassiev said, is China and the New Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative. This Operation Juarez proposal from Lin in 1982 is a 100-page proposal, which he wrote in answer to requests from President Jose Lopez Portillo's government, saying the bankers have just stolen $25 billion out of the country in 1 year. They are going to they're out to defeat our attempt to become a new Japan south of the border. And Brzezinski famously said, no Japans, no development allowed in the developing sector, or as he said, south of the border. So LaRouche answered that by producing a strategy for how Ibero-America and the Caribbean could turn the table on the financiers by uniting their forces, declaring the debt moratorium jointly, and use that, which could bring down the advanced sector banking system if they didn't negotiate, use that as a lever to get the industrial interests, because there were some at that time in Europe and the United States, very important ones, who were interested in producing, to get them to tell the bankers, join with the developing sector, tell the bankers, you know what, you've had your run, you blew it, you're going to be under our control and our interests from here on out. So that's what I'm saying. He never presented something that was, he also developed, by the way, the concept of how Ibero-America could unite at that time and defend itself against what he calculated would be at least 6 months of economic warfare total from the advanced sector, but they have enough resources of this and that energy and where their scarcities were, and he mapped it out. And the book that Diane showed you, and actually I think, Jose, you have a copy of it, the Ibero-American Integration book, a team in the area of people in the US and people in those countries took LaRouche's Operation Juarez and developed it out in specific, the maps, the roads, the railroads, and everything. So that's what he did. That's how that look. And that book still stands. It didn't work and it didn't succeed then, but that idea is live and got legs. Okay, now just briefly to end, the China and the Belt and Road Initiative. LaRouche never went to China, but his wife took his ideas there. She visited there at least 4 times between 96 and 2014, and I didn't count the number of trips after that. There've been many. And she presented the Eurasian land bridge proposals that Diane showed you. And she spoke at 2 conferences that China held on the Eurasian land bridge concept in 1996 and 1997. So when Xi Jinping announced in 2013, I am wrapping up, Diane, here, his proposal for the New Silk Road, Helga was invited back to China immediately to talk about it, and she was interviewed, for example, on one of the major primetime CCTV dialogue programs by their leading producer, who introduced her as the person who, quote, first advocated the idea of a Eurasian land bridge more than 20 years ago, and said that she is referred to as a New Silk Road lady. When the Shaw Institute then produced, and Jose, you have a picture of some covers there, in 2014, since this idea was going all over the world, the Eurasian land bridge around the Silk Road was building, we produced our first report called, not that one, no, the one with the 3 covers, on the Silk Road, how the Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, extending this idea to all the continents. There you go. And in 2015, we translated it into Chinese. We had people in China had it translated into Chinese. And at the presentation, the press conference in, I think it was September of 2015, 8 top Chinese scholars spoke about the importance of this concept of the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, the Schiller Institute work, what LaRouche had done, one after the other. I'm going to read only some of one. Ding Yi Fan, who had been deputy director of the World Development Institute of the Development Research Center of the State Council of the People's Republic of China, no small figure. He wrote, he said there, I have known the Schiller Institute for a long time, and I have learned much from them. They have a very specific ideas about the world economy. The concept underlying LaRouche's view of the economy is that of the physical economy. LaRouche used the term negentropy to characterize the underlying laws of a healthy, functioning economy. So I recommend you follow Glassiev, the Chinese, and those Indians who are following LaRouche's ideas, and we can do the same thing here.
That's boldly optimistic. But I really appreciate that, Gretchen. We have a meeting coming up pertaining to some logistics for the Rage Against the War rally, but I do want to have a little discussion. And also I'm thinking there's just so much material here. Maybe we should do another week of this. I don't know if you're available next Friday, but I would like to extend it another week because we have wonderful videos of LaRouche speaking. And
yes.
I think people have to really get a sense, why do we have so much authority in this moment? Why does Helga have the authority that she has? Who are we? This, as Lynn said, this little organization that recruited whatever it was at that day, 85 nations and however many billions of people. And now it's more and much more advanced. But Jose, I'm wondering if any of this is new to you and what your thoughts are seeing it, if you're able to talk to us.
I am able to, sorry. Yes, I am able to talk to you. Give me 1 second here while I come back onto the screen. Okay. There we go. And then I have to add myself here. Look, I think I only ever really heard about what was going on with the organization. I hear it now. I hear it, based off what Diane went through and what you went through, Gretchen. I guess I didn't really live it myself. I guess I lived it, what's the word, through you, both of you. But now we kind of see elements of that in the way they're trying to subvert this rally that we're going to on Sunday. I mean, they are just throwing mud at Diane and at the other speakers and myself too. I don't know how I got caught in the crossfire also. I don't know what I did, but and the whole LaRouche organization, articles have been put out, supposedly that we're a cult and we're so irrelevant that everybody in the world loves to talk about us, which is a great thing, I guess. And we have congressmen responding to us, like I just showed in the beginning, which I was muted for, by the way. The stream could not hear me. I will just pull this up really quickly, because what I was trying to show was Richie Torres did respond. And I'm just putting this back up here. My town hall was hijacked by pro-Putin propagandists who blamed the U.S. rather than Vladimir Putin for Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. It's tragic to see useful idiots whitewashing Putin's war crimes. I stand with the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom. And so for me, I see just like a tiny fraction of what you guys went through, because you guys had like the FBI directly raiding you guys, putting you guys in jail. But I guess because of the experience that you guys have had, you guys are experts in dealing with any kind of infiltration and any kind of FBI involvement, and you've been able to share this wisdom. And they've lumped all of us together in the sense of all the speakers have now been lumped together as this one, like, do not go to them, do not associate with them. And it's actually allowed us to build bridges where we probably wouldn't have been able to before. So those are my thoughts.
That's true. That's true. And I actually only met LaRouche, I said, the first time at that conference in 1988. I was a student in Boston where the trial was ongoing. I did not have the opportunity of being around during all this super exciting work in the early 80s, as I guess Gretchen was?
1976. Yeah, we could talk about that. When I was in Peru, and we got the Peruvian foreign minister to propose a debt moratorium. That's a real story. And Jose, I was a little older than you then, maybe, or your age. And it was all very new to me. And I remember when he came on and did that, the news item, he did it in Manila. I was jumping up and down. I couldn't believe that we had the power that we do have because of what LaRouche's ideas are. People don't believe ideas are powerful. They are.
Oh, I completely agree. I got no money, I got no resources, and yet here I am being a part of the national dialogue and conversation. So all based off ideas. So
Right. Well,
go.
that's the point. And I think we're going to have to continue this next week because it's just so rich and people need it. From some of the comments that I'm getting, people on Facebook and YouTube saying, I'd had no idea of any of this. Thank you so much. I love Gretchen. Someone
I'm taken.
Your husband, but so I think we need to do more of this, because you see the potential now. These people are bankrupt. They have nothing new. And the world is moving, as Glaziev said, with the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And they didn't succeed at getting rid of us. And I think what happens on Sunday, they have failed. They have put us in such great danger that people have decided they don't care what names they're called, that maybe there's something they can learn from associating with us. So it's an extremely rich moment. I would urge everybody on this call to plan to be in Washington, D.C. or in any of the other rallies on Sunday, the 19th. It starts at 12:30 at the Lincoln Memorial. Tune into the Schiller Institute for the conferences next week. Tuesday, there's a day of action on Capitol Hill. We have a bunch of meetings set up with various members of Congress. Call your congressman. Tell them no more money to Ukraine. We're not going to fund weapons to Ukraine. We have to get a negotiated settlement. The offer of Pope Francis to host negotiations without conditionalities should be accepted. President Lula of Brazil had a similar message, that he thinks there should be a group of nations. So the world is wondering if the American people are going to weigh in. And Jose, I think what you said is a really good example. No one should be quiet. You can say, oh, my vote has been stolen, or it doesn't count, or whatever excuse. I was blocked on Facebook, but you're not in prison. Most of us are not. We are not starving to death, hopefully. You have a voice. You can make yourself heard, and we have to do that, and we can change. The people are still the most powerful branch of government in the United States. That's why they want to brainwash us and keep us from coming together. So thank you very much, both Gretchen and Jose, and we'll see everybody.